If you can fix it, I will reward you with an unimaginable reward.
That reward will be mine soon.
Fix this and I'll give you $100 Midos. Veteran CEO Sneered Maid's daughter did. He froze in shock. Fix this in front of everyone, Captain Marcus Thorne said, his voice flat as a stamped serial number, and I'll lock in your job for life, plus $100,000 for medical bills. Fail, and you're out. The Titan CNC idled like a caged animal at the heart of the Detroit Defense Works, its armored casing nicked by years of rushed upgrades and midnight patch jobs. It was supposed to be the miracle. $2 million of precision, a linchpin for armored vehicle engines. Instead, it died every time at the 90-second mark, throwing the same fatal message, cascading resonance fault. 6 weeks, $200,000 in overtime, a hangar full of veterans with gold hands and haunted eyes. And still, the Titan choked. Amelia Hayes stood frozen beneath the gantry crane, a spray bottle dangling from trembling fingers. She was a widow, surviving on double shifts and a prayer that the VA reimbursement would arrive before the next chemo cycle. Thorne's offer wasn't an offer. It was a trap laid in front of her co-workers, a public dare dressed up as a contract. She opened her mouth, but nothing came. 100 faces turned away, shame cutting sharper than sheet metal. The Titan's coolant pump hissed. A red strobe ticked like a heartbeat with a murmur. "I can't," she managed. Thorne pivoted, victory already rising to his lips. That was when a child's voice cut through the clang and echo. "My mom can't," the girl said, small and steady at the bay door, "but I can." Chloe Hayes stepped into the spill of fluorescence, a 10-year-old in an oversized field jacket, a battered crew cap clutched to her chest like a relic. She walked past the racks of tool carts and coiled airlines, past a forest of crossed arms and doubtful smirks, until she stood with her chin tilted toward the Titan. "You'll fix a defense-grade machine by bedtime?" Thorne laughed, too loud, too sure. "No, sir," she said, eyes never leaving the machine. "I'll listen to it." The room held its breath. Someone killed the radio. Somewhere a relay clicked. A supervising officer from Wright-Patterson stopped writing in her notebook. 90 seconds had beaten engineers, algorithms, and the pride of a hard-bitten shop. But for the first time since the Titan arrived, everyone leaned in, not to watch a failure, but to hear a child place her ear to metal and ask a monster to tell the truth. Detroit After Dark is a mosaic of sodium lamps and steel, a city that knows the grammar of machines. The Defense Works sits in an old brick husk at the edge of the industrial corridor, a government-stamped resurrection of a plant that once birthed crankshafts by the mile. Inside, the air has its own weather, warm with coolant vapor, sweet with cutting oil, threaded with the metallic ozone of arc flashes from the welding bays. Overhead, a gantry crane creeps along its rails with the patience of a heavy animal, paint scabbed and yellow. Lines of green tape grid the floor into zones, inspection, staging, test stand, each marked in stencils as crisp as parade boots. In the center, under a halo of white LEDs, the Titan sits like a monument, armored skin, labyrinth vents, spindle head gleaming as though it had its own intentions. Captain Marcus Thorne knows every echo in this shop. He's 45, square-jawed in the way recruiters put on posters, his hair clipped to regulation, even though no one can order him to do it now. 20 years in the Army's Engineer Corps carved certain habits into him. Standing to speak, hands behind his back to listen, scanning exits without moving his head. In photos that line the corkboard in the break room, he is always at the edge of the frame, hard to read, a half smile at most. His people, most of them veterans, call him sir when they forget, Marcus when they remember their civilians. He doesn't correct either. He built this team like he once built forward operating bases. Pick competence over comfort, loyalty over charm. There's Ortiz, still moving like a squad leader, methodical. The guy who can feel a misalignment in his palm before a caliper can prove it. There's Nguyen, who speaks softly to software the way some folks whisper to spooked horses, a calm that makes broken code behave. There's Doc Alvarez, nicknamed for the way he triages tool room emergencies and orders parts with the triage of a medic. And there's Singer, too young to have seen Kandahar and too old to be called kid, who learned machines the hard way, one scraped knuckle at a time. They aren't perfect, but they show up early, leave late, and work like the floor underneath them could vanish if they slack. The flaw in the Titan humbles them. The fault is clean, clinical, merciless, cascading resonance. The spindle hits speed, the harmonic stacks, and at 90 seconds, the control throws a red flag. The coolant shutters sigh, and silence pours in. They have chased the ghost with FEM sims, with swapped bearings and altered feeds and speeds, with a half-dozen vendor techs dialing in from 3 time zones. They have logged every attempt in a binder that weighs like a brick. Nothing moves the needle. Marcus hates failure. He hates it because he knows what it costs. Overtime paid for with line items meant for other veterans. Hours stolen from families. Dignity eaten by the slow acid of a problem that won't yield. The call from a colonel at Wright-Patterson this morning was polite and edged with steel. Schedules, deliverables, congressional oversight. Marcus hears the words and also hears what comes after if he misses again. Audits, closures, a headline that makes people point at the word boondoggle and nod. Amelia Hayes works the edges of the shop like a ghost who tidies after the living. She's 38, shoulders strong from lifting mop buckets and moving waste bins that insist on being heavier than they look. Her wedding band lives on a chain around her neck, 2 scratches through the gold where a medic once cut tape. She doesn't talk about the chemo unless HR needs a form. She doesn't ask for favors. She wipes a streak from a window, the glass catching the Titan's LED halo and throwing it back as a smear of cold fire. She watches how the men and women in coveralls carry their fatigue. They don't complain, but they lean on benches a beat longer than they used to. She knows that lean. Her husband had it in the months before he passed. Chloe knows the shop from a child's height. She's 10, but on some days, her eyes make her look older than her fingers admit. She collects sounds the way other kids collect stickers. The coolant pump's low thrum is one note. The spindles rise another. The chatter that crawls up the walls a third. She has a small spiral notebook, ruled paper, purple cover, where she writes them like music, naming them with words her grandfather taught her: whine, sing, flutter, ping. She wears his old crew cap turned forward, brim bent just so, and when she's nervous, she touches the embroidered patch with her thumb. It smells faintly of jet fuel no amount of washings could quite erase. Her grandfather's name is Elias Vance, and in the photos on Amelia's phone, he's stocky and sun-browned, eyes squinting in the California light, a man who could coax grudging life from a turbine with a wrench and a prayer. He worked flight lines at Travis, when phantoms still howled at the sky and the ground shook under their departures. He taught Chloe that machines tell the truth if you learn their language. "Don't just look," he would say, tapping her forehead with a calloused finger. "Listen here and here." He'd tap her sternum then, because some truths are felt before they're measured. Lieutenant Colonel Susan Reed arrives with the day's second clipboard and none of the day's doubt. She's Air Force, 40, with the posture of someone whose spine has never forgiven a single slouch. The fabric of her flight jacket sits just so on her shoulders. She wears a whistle on a retractable cord and a pen that clicks with authority. She has watched too many promising programs drown in optimism. She doesn't have time to be charmed by promises, but she is the rare oversight officer who reads specs at home for pleasure and who knows when to get out of the way of people who do real work. She listens more than she speaks, and when she speaks, things shift. Tonight, the shop is a ring of attention around the Titan. The machine's console screen is a pale rectangle in the gloom when someone kills the overheads to reduce noise glare for the microphones. The hum from the HVAC becomes a river. Marcus folds his arms and measures the faces in the circle. Anticipation, skepticism, resignation, a flicker of something like hope. Hope is dangerous in a shop. Hope makes your hands shake. But it is also the only fuel left when anger burns out. Thorne's bet, his dare really, wasn't born from cruelty alone. Pressure has edges, and it cuts down, and he let it cut. When he said the words to Amelia, a part of him heard himself from another life, a younger officer barking at a sergeant to make an impossible timetable because an air corridor depended on it. He knows that part of himself is useful in war and a liability in rooms where people go home to their kids. When Chloe steps into the pool of light, Reed's pen stops. Ortiz shifts his weight off his bad knee. Nguyen blinks behind fogged safety glasses as if something in his code finally compiled. Amelia goes pale and then red and then something steadier than both. Marcus watches the girl without blinking. She doesn't fidget. She doesn't look at him. She looks at the Titan the way a medic looks at a kid who won't wake, with respect and refusal in equal measure. Around them, Detroit breathes. Trains drum in the distance. A siren dopplers down the boulevard and is gone. The shop floor is marked with the footprints of 100 days and the scuffs of 1,000 fixes. It smells like work. It looks like second chances. Chloe sets her notebook down on a tool cart and climbs the step to the Titan service platform. "Permission to approach," she says, because Grandpa taught her manners and machines demand them. Marcus nods. Reed steps closer, half wary, half intrigued. Amelia's hand finds the pocket where she keeps a tissue and doesn't take it out. "Everyone quiet," Chloe says without lifting her voice. It carries anyway. Radios die. Conversations fold. Ortiz reaches over his head and silences the crane with a thumb on a red mushroom button. The machine's main breaker clunks. For a beat, the shop is so quiet they can hear the little clicks the LEDs make when their drivers settle. Chloe lays both palms on the Titan's skin and closes her eyes. "Tell me what hurts," she whispers, a habit more than a command. The Titan, indifferent and immense, waits for its cycle. Marcus clears his throat. He looks at Reed. Reed lifts her chin. Go. Singer hits the start sequence. The spindle begins its ascent from silence to song. The Titan's whir built into a scream, a sound engineered to be efficient, yet always brushing the edge of menace. 90 seconds was the line, Every technician knew it. Every notebook had the time circled. Every failed attempt ended with that cursed red fault message. Tonight, the stakes had sharpened into something more personal. This wasn't just a test of mettle. It was a trial of dignity. Marcus Thorne stood with his arms behind his back, posture immaculate, eyes fixed on the countdown, as if willing the numbers to shift through discipline alone. His voice had carried earlier like a whip crack when he mocked Amelia. "Let's see if the janitor's child prodigy can save what my best men couldn't." The words still hung in the rafters, bitter and heavy. Men and women who had served under him in desert heat and mountain cold shifted uncomfortably. They were loyal, yes, but none of them had ever liked watching a commanding officer kicked down instead of out. Amelia clutched her rag too tightly, knuckles pale, her whole body quivering under the fluorescent glare. Every tick of the clock was another measure of humiliation. She had cleaned these floors for months, unseen and unacknowledged, until tonight her life had been dragged into the circle of judgment. Losing the wager would mean more than a paycheck. It meant losing the fragile rope she had tied around her family's survival. Chloe, small frame dwarfed by the Titan's bulk, stood straight as if the machine itself demanded her respect. Yet she could hear them, the low chuckles, the muttered bets traded like playing cards among the crew. "Kid's out of her depth. She'll run home crying. Captain's making a point." The words were sharp, even when whispered, meant to cut without leaving fingerprints. Colonel Reed watched from the periphery, her expression a study in neutrality. She took notes without raising her eyes, but her silence was another kind of judgment. If the girl failed, Reed would record it as a line item in the report. Unconventional intervention attempted, unsuccessful. Bureaucracy had no space for tears. The Titan hit 75 seconds. Chloe pressed her palms harder into the steel. She tilted her head like a bird catching a distant vibration, her lips moving in a whisper only she could hear. At 85 seconds, Marcus leaned forward. "Prepare yourselves," he announced, his tone already savoring vindication. "We all know what comes next." The machine convulsed, just as it always did. The vibration deepened into a harsh rattle, resonance stacking like cards in a doomed house. 90 seconds. The screen flashed red. Fault, cascading resonance. Emergency stop. The spindle whined down into silence, leaving a vacuum filled with laughter. Savage laughter, coarse and careless, spilled from the technicians who had given up hope weeks ago. They laughed not at the girl, but at their own exhaustion, at the absurdity of thinking a child could undo what they could not. But to Chloe, it felt like a wall of ridicule crashing over her. Her throat tightened. She had heard soldiers laugh like that at her grandfather when he claimed machine spoke. It was the laugh of men convinced of their own superiority. Marcus allowed himself a thin smile, one corner of his mouth curving with something close to cruelty. "Well," he said, drawing the word long, "it seems fairy tales don't fix million-dollar machines. Amelia, you and your daughter, wait." Chloe's voice cut in, soft but firm. She didn't look at Marcus. She didn't look at anyone. Her eyes were fixed on the panel of the Titan, where her small hand still rested. That wasn't failure. That was the machine telling us where to look. A wave of scoffs swept the floor. Singer, the youngest tech, muttered, "It's dead, kid. Everyone knows it. 90 seconds. End of story." Ortiz shook his head, disgust hidden in the motion. Alvarez exhaled through his teeth. weary. The ridicule wasn't loud now, but it was worse. Disbelief, dismissal, the sort of disdain that eats deeper than outright jeers. Amelia reached for her daughter, whispering, "Chloe, please, enough." Her voice cracked under the weight of fear. She wanted to protect the child from further humiliation, to shield her from men's derision, sharpened by their own pride. But Chloe stepped forward, pulling free, her face pale and resolute. "I heard it," she repeated. "A ping under the spindle housing. You all heard noise. I heard language." The laughter faltered into uneasy silence. Even mockery has limits, and conviction spoken in a child's voice carries a strange gravity. Yet Marcus's eyes narrowed, suspicion carving his brow. He sensed defiance, and defiance in his shop was mutiny. "You claim you heard what no censor has caught?" His voice boomed, sarcasm dripping. "Perhaps next you'll tell us ghosts whisper in the coolant lines." A few chuckles broke out again, nervous, half-hearted. Chloe's shoulders shook, but not with fear, with determination. She raised the battered crew cap from her grandfather and held it to her chest like a shield. "He taught me to listen when everyone else mocked him too," she said. Her voice wavered, but did not fall. For a moment, something flickered across Reed's face, an eyebrow raised, the faintest shift of interest. Marcus noticed. His jaw tightened. If this girl somehow convinced Reed, it would not just be a joke gone too far. It would be his authority undermined in front of his people. The humiliation pressed on Amelia's family from every angle. The mother cornered by desperation, the daughter scorned by professionals, the crowd amused at their expense. Even the Titan seemed complicit, its silent mass looming over them, a monument to failure. The weight was unbearable, and yet, beneath it, the first embers of defiance glowed. The test had ended, but the conflict had only just begun. The workshop emptied slowly that night, the laughter lingering longer than the men themselves. Amelia wanted nothing more than to gather her daughter and flee into the anonymity of the Detroit night. But Colonel Reed halted her at the doorway. "One more test tomorrow," she said evenly. "The girl may proceed if she chooses." Then Reed walked away without waiting for a reply. It was not permission. It was a command dressed as indifference. Back in their small apartment above a laundromat, Amelia scolded Chloe for stepping forward. "You don't understand, Mihija," she whispered fiercely, her hands trembling as she folded uniforms that smelled of bleach. "Men like Marcus, they break people for sport. I can't lose this job. We can't survive another blow." Her words cracked under the weight of unpaid bills stacked like grenades on the kitchen counter. But Chloe's gaze was steady. "Mama, I heard it. Abuelo wasn't wrong. Machines talk if you listen." She opened the old cedar box she kept beneath her bed. Inside lay her grandfather's relics, a grease-stained manual, a pair of worn leather gloves, and the battered stethoscope he had used not for hearts, but for engines. She lifted it with reverence, as if it were a relic from a church. "He taught me, and he said one day I'd need to prove it." Amelia pressed her palms over her eyes. She had grown up in the shadow of Elias Vance's impossible standards, stories of a master sergeant who could coax crippled aircraft back into flight when all seemed lost. To her, he had been less a man than a legend, but also a ghost who left his daughter and granddaughter with more stories than security. Amelia remembered hospital nights when he coughed up steel dust phlegm, his body eaten by decades of jet fuel and silence. He had died with nothing but a pension, too thin to bury him properly, and yet his lessons had imprinted on Chloe like sacred scripture. That night, as Amelia cried quietly at the table, Chloe sat on the floor with the stethoscope pressed against the radiator pipe, listening to its uneven pulse. She scribbled notes in the margins of Rilke's letters to a young poet, notes not about poetry, but about rhythm, resonance, the heartbeat of machines. The radiator thumped, sputtered, and groaned. Chloe's small hand traced patterns on paper, capturing its song. She wasn't playing, she was practicing. Morning arrived with the smell of oil and cold steel. Marcus entered the shop before the crew, his boots striking the floor in crisp staccato. He had not slept. All night, the memory of the girl's voice had gnawed at him, its certainty unsettling. He loathed the thought of being mocked by a child before Reed. To prove her wrong was not enough. He needed to crush the defiance that had flared in her eyes. Authority demanded it. When Amelia and Chloe arrived, escorted reluctantly by the bus's diesel growl, Marcus barked, "Well, prodigy, your stage awaits. Fail again, and this farce ends." He gestured at the Titan, its massive frame glinting under the halogen lights, but Colonel Reed intervened. "Let her attempt with her own tools," she ordered. Her eyes flicked to the battered stethoscope in Chloe's hand. The room snickered. Marcus clenched his jaw, but said nothing. As Chloe approached the machine, her mind drifted back years earlier to long summer days in her grandfather's garage. Elias Vance had smelled of tobacco and engine grease, his hand-scarred maps of decades spent in service bays from Da Nang to Travis Air Force Base. He had sat her on his lap at the age of 5, pressing the stethoscope to the belly of an old Chevy truck. "Listen," he whispered, "not with your ears, with your patience. Machines lie to the careless. They tell the truth only to those who respect them." She remembered nights when he told war stories, how in '72 a Phantom jet had limped home with hydraulics shredded, and how he alone had kept it airborne. "I didn't fix metal," he told her. "I fixed despair. I told the machine it could hold a little longer, and it did." She had believed every word, because his voice carried the weight of a man who had looked death in the eye and persuaded it to wait. Those memories now wrapped around her like armor. She placed the stethoscope against the Titan's frame and closed her eyes. The crew shifted uncomfortably, embarrassed by the child's pantomime. But when the machine roared to life, her face changed. She was not a child anymore. She was Elias Vance's heir. At first it was the same chaos, the roar of hydraulics, the grind of gears, the steady climb of vibration. But Chloe leaned into it, lips parting as if tasting the sound. She whispered to herself, 40 hertz, rising, 60, stable, 80, anomaly. Her hand shot up. "Stop," Marcus sneered. "We run it to 90, always." "Stop," she insisted, "or the fracture doubles." Reed gave the order, and the machine cut off. Silence slammed down. Chloe traced the metal casing with her fingers, stopping at a particular bolt near the spindle. She tapped it gently with her knuckle, listening as if to a door hiding secrets. Then she turned to Marcus. "This is where it bleeds." A scoff rippled through the room. "Bleeds?" Singer muttered. "It's a machine, not a soldier." But Ortiz crouched, flashlight in hand, peering close, his breath caught. "Sir, there's discoloration, heat stress pattern." She might be right. Marcus felt heat rise in his neck. His authority was slipping. He barked, "Disassemble it!" The crew moved quickly, removing the bolt, threading in a fiber optic scope. The monitor lit up with the impossible. A spiderweb fracture, invisible to all scans, glowing faintly with trapped heat. Exactly where Chloe had said. A stunned hush fell. Reed's pen scratched across her notepad. Amelia clutched her chest, caught between pride and fear. And Marcus. Marcus stared at the crack as though it had been carved into his own pride. His mind raced back to stories his father told of a mechanic named Vance who saved his life in Vietnam. Could this girl be? He shoved the thought away. To admit it would mean surrender. That night, as Amelia tucked her daughter into the worn sofa bed, Chloe whispered, "Abuelo was here today. I felt him." She clutched the stethoscope tightly. Amelia kissed her forehead and turned off the light, her heart breaking with the knowledge that her father's lessons had placed her child in the line of fire of men's egos. But Chloe slept peacefully. She dreamed not of ridicule, but of a hangar filled with engines, each whispering secrets only she could hear. And in the shadows stood Elias Vance, arms crossed, nodding with approval. The hidden past had risen to the surface, and it was only the beginning of the storm that would follow. The next morning, the workshop buzzed with a tension sharper than the hiss of the compressed airlines. Word of the child's miracle diagnosis had spread beyond the shop floor. Engineers from other projects crowded the mezzanine railings. Veterans with grease on their coveralls stood shoulder to shoulder with men in suits from the Pentagon's procurement office. The Titan was no longer just a machine. It was a crucible, and Chloe Hayes stood at its center. Amelia tried to hold her daughter back, whispering fiercely, "This isn't our fight. You proved your point yesterday. Don't go further." But Chloe shook her head. "Mama, it's not finished. Abuelo always said, if you hear the wound, you must heal it." The stethoscope dangled from her neck like a medal she had never asked for, but could not refuse. Captain Marcus Thorne entered with military precision, his presence sucking the air out of the room. He knew he was cornered. The girl's discovery had embarrassed him in front of Reed, his crew, and worse, the Washington observers who controlled his funding. But pride is a stubborn commander. He had one chance to reclaim dominance, force her to fail in public. He strode to the Titan, slammed a palm against its steel flank, and barked, "Run it again. This time, the girl leads. If she falters, she's finished, and so is her mother's job." His voice carried like a verdict. The crew hesitated, glancing at Reed. The colonel gave no sign of objection. She folded her arms, her face unreadable. The silence pressed down until Chloe stepped forward. She looked up at Marcus, not with fear, but with something fiercer, conviction. "I'll do it," she said, "but not on your terms. If I succeed, you will apologize to my mother here in front of everyone." Gasps rippled. No one had ever spoken to Marcus Thorne like that. Not technicians, not officers, not Pentagon men in $1,000 suits. His jaw tightened, but his pride forced him into the trap. "Fine," he snapped. "When you fail, remember you demanded the stage." The machine roared to life. The floor vibrated. The lights above flickered. Chloe pressed the stethoscope against the frame, her small face set in concentration. Seconds ticked. 40, 60, 80. The same death march as always. The fracture threatened to escalate, and Marcus smirked, already preparing to declare victory. But Chloe raised her hand. "Slow the feed rate, 10%. Ortiz obeyed instinctively, his veteran reflex overriding Marcus's scowl. The pitch of the machine shifted. The deadly resonance softened. Chloe tilted her head, listening harder. "Now, Apply counterbalance on spindle rotation, manual override. Singer frowned but moved to the console, his eyes locked on hers as if she had become the commanding officer. The seconds passed. 85, 90, 95. The Titan still roared, stable, alive. A cheer began, hushed by the gravity of the moment. The child had not only diagnosed, she had commanded. The impossible had bent beneath her will. Chloe opened her eyes and spoke into the stunned silence. It's not magic. It's listening. Machines don't fail without speaking first. You just never listened. The room erupted. Reed allowed herself the ghost of a smile. Amelia's tears fell freely, and Marcus, pale and rigid, stared at the girl who had undone him with nothing but patience and faith. For the first time in his career, he felt truly defenseless, not against a weapon, but against truth. The turning point had come. Authority no longer lived in Marcus's shadow. It had shifted unmistakably to the child with the stethoscope. The Titan had roared past 90 seconds. Now it was climbing toward 2 minutes, 3, 4. The cursed wall of failure shattered by a girl whose head barely reached the console. Around her, the hangar-like workshop quivered with disbelief. Men who had logged 20 years in combat engineering, who had been taught that technology bowed only to precision instruments and multi-million-dollar software, now stared at a child wielding nothing more than her grandfather's stethoscope. Captain Marcus Thorne's smirk had evaporated. His posture stiffened into a brittle statue of authority, but his eyes betrayed him. They darted from the machine's monitors to Colonel Reed's impassive face, then to the Pentagon officials, whispering among themselves. His career, his pride, his very identity as the unbreakable officer was unraveling. "Stabilize coolant flow," Chloe instructed, her voice clear, though her hands trembled slightly. "You're overcompensating for thermal stress." Ortiz moved at once, his weathered fingers dancing over the console. Singer, who had doubted her the loudest, hovered behind her now like a student desperate not to miss a single lesson. Even the Pentagon observers leaned forward, their pens forgotten. Every command from Chloe came like a code carried over from another generation, and each adjustment brought the Titan closer to perfect balance. Amelia, her mother, stood frozen at the edge of the floor, clutching her cleaning rag like a lifeline. Tears blurred her vision, but she could not look away. Her daughter, who just days earlier had been invisible to these men, now commanded them as if she had been born for it. She whispered a prayer in Spanish. "Gracias, Elias. You gave her the courage I never had." Marcus finally broke. "Enough!" he barked, his voice cracking against the concrete walls. "Shut it down! This is a farce. A child cannot—" But before he finished, the Titan completed its first flawless production cycle. The freshly milled armor component slid into the tray, gleaming with precision tolerances tighter than any they had achieved in 6 weeks of failure. The part was perfect, not acceptable, perfect. The workshop erupted, cheering, clapping. Even a few battle-hardened veterans whistled like boys at a ball game. Ortiz slapped Singer on the back. Reed scribbled something in her notebook, then closed it with a finality that sounded like judgment passed. The Pentagon officials exchanged wide-eyed looks, already drafting reports in their heads about the miracle fix and the little girl who had achieved it. Marcus stood motionless amid the storm, pale as chalk. He could feel the authority bleeding out of him with every cheer. The Titan had been his fortress, his final proof that he was indispensable. Now, before the entire program, it had become his executioner. and the executioner's hand belonged to a maid's daughter. Chloe turned to face him. Her chest rose and fell quickly, her cheeks flushed from effort, but her eyes, her grandfather's eyes, were steady. "You promised, Captain," she said, "in front of everyone. You owe my mother an apology." The words cut deeper than any blade. Marcus's throat worked, but no sound came out. All his life he had commanded others to bend. Apology was not in his vocabulary. It was a weakness, a surrender. But the silence pressed down heavier than enemy fire. Even the cheering subsided into an expectant hush. The room itself seemed to demand it. Amelia shook her head, whispering, "Chloe, don't. Let it go." She feared what a humiliated officer might do, how vengeance might lash out in the aftermath. But Chloe only repeated softly, yet unyieldingly, "Apologize." Reed's voice, cool and clipped, cut through the tension. "Captain Thorne, a deal was struck in my presence. Fulfill it, or I will report your breach of honor directly to command." Her tone was iron. There was no refuge in defiance. Marcus's lips trembled. The great Captain Thorne, the man who had humiliated veterans and bullied subordinates, lowered his head in front of a maid and her daughter. His words scraped out like rusted metal. "I apologize." The hanger held its breath. Marcus's face twisted in pain as if the word itself were poison. "I apologize," he repeated louder, "to Mrs. Hayes and her daughter." A roar of approval thundered through the workshop, not just because a wrong had been righted, but because they had witnessed the impossible. Power humbled before truth. Chloe's small shoulders relaxed. She nodded once, then stepped back into her mother's arms. Amelia knelt and wrapped her close, sobbing quietly into her daughter's hair. For the first time in years, Amelia felt the crushing weight of her life's burdens lift, not because money had been promised, not because the machine now worked, but because her daughter had forced the world to see them. Marcus stumbled back a step, the applause battering him harder than any enemy's assault. He tried to muster anger, but all that came was emptiness. In the reflection of the tightened steel, he saw himself, a man undone by arrogance, defeated not by an enemy, but by the honesty of a child who dared to listen. Reed approached Amelia and Chloe. "The contract for full benefits is yours," she said, "effective immediately. I'll personally oversee it." She knelt slightly to meet Chloe's eyes. "And as for you, you just rewrote what this program thought was possible. Remember this moment. You didn't just fix a machine, you changed how we look at who can lead." The Pentagon officials, already recovering from their shock, began circling with questions, proposals, offers. Chloe clung to her mother, uninterested in their words. She had done what needed doing, nothing more. At the edge of the crowd, Marcus slipped toward the exit. No one stopped him. He was already irrelevant. His name would live in the program's memory, but not as its savior, as its cautionary tale. That night, the Titan ran its first full production shift without a single failure. The hangar glowed with light, and the veterans who had nearly lost faith in their craft now moved with renewed pride. Yet, for all the triumph, the most indelible image remained the smallest. A girl with a stethoscope pressed against a wall of steel, proving that even the mightiest machine could be tamed not by brute force, but by listening. And somewhere beyond the ceiling beams, in the quiet of Amelia's dreams, Master Sergeant Elias Vance surely smiled. His lesson had lived on. His granddaughter had carried it further than he ever imagined. The climax was complete. The Titan, was reborn, and Marcus Thorne's empire of pride lay in ruins at the feet of a child. The Titan's steady hum filled the workshop long after the applause had ebbed. For most, it was the sound of triumph. For Marcus Thorne, it was the tolling of a bell, his authority dying in plain sight. He lingered near the exit, but every whispered glance, every averted gaze was a dagger. Men who had once snapped to attention at his commands now looked through him, their loyalty dissolved. Colonel Reed stepped forward, clipboard under her arm, her voice cold as steel. "Captain Thorne, I'll be filing my report within the hour. It will state that you failed to resolve a 6-week crisis. That resolution came instead from an outside civilian, a 10-year-old girl." She paused, letting the weight of those words echo. "Command will decide your future, but I suspect your resignation will reach them before my report does." The Pentagon observers did not contradict her. One of them, a gray-haired official in a tailored suit, merely scribbled something in his notebook, then looked up with a faint smirk. Marcus knew that look. He had been dismissed, already erased from relevance. He opened his mouth, desperate for a final stand. "You think this proves anything? A child got lucky, that's all. I carried this program for years." Singer cut him off, his voice ringing with newfound confidence. "No, sir. You carried your pride. We carried the work. And today, she carried us all across the finish line." The veterans behind him murmured in agreement. For the first time, the crew had spoken not as subordinates, but as men freed from fear. Marcus's face flushed crimson. He wanted to lash out, but there was nothing left to command. Even Amelia, once invisible to him, now met his gaze without flinching. He had mocked her as expendable, yet it was her child who had redeemed the project and forced him to bow. Chloe stepped forward, her voice quiet but unyielding. "My abuelo used to say, 'The strongest man is the one who knows when to listen.' You never listened, Captain. That's why you lost." The words struck harder than any military tribunal. A child had handed him his epitaph. The room was silent, waiting. Marcus felt it. Judgment not from officers or officials, but from the very men he had once led. His chest tightened. For the first time, he felt small. Without another word, he turned and left. No one followed. No one saluted. The great Captain Thorne vanished through the hangar doors, carrying nothing but the echo of his disgrace. The downfall was complete. Authority had shifted forever, and Marcus Thorne's name would linger only as the lesson carved into every veteran's memory. Arrogance is always the last uniform to fall. The Titan continued to purr, its rhythm steady and strong, as though the machine itself were breathing for the first time. Around it, the veterans lingered, not to marvel at steel and circuits, but to witness the quiet revolution that had just taken place. In that moment, the workshop was no longer just a government facility. It was a sanctuary where courage and humility had found their truest expression. Amelia knelt beside her daughter, pulling Chloe into her arms. The woman's tears were not born of weakness, but of release, of debts finally lifted, of fears dissolved. For years, she had carried the crushing weight of widowhood, of unpaid medical bills, of nights scrubbing floors while her child waited alone. Tonight, all of it seemed to fade beneath the glow of her daughter's triumph. Colonel Reed placed a steady hand on Amelia's shoulder. "Your family will not be forgotten again," she said with rare softness. "I will ensure it." For the first time in years, Amelia believed those words. Chloe, small yet unshakable, walked back to the Titan and rested her palm on the warm steel. "Machines are like people," she whispered. "They need someone to hear what hurts." The veterans around her exchanged quiet nods. They knew she wasn't speaking of machines alone. In the weeks that followed, the workshop transformed. The Elias Vance Technical Center was established, named after Chloe's grandfather, the man who had once saved a stranded pilot in Vietnam and whose legacy had now saved a program decades later. Veterans returned not only to work, but to teach, mentoring younger generations in both craft and character. The Titan became a symbol of resilience, but Chloe became its heart. As for Marcus Thorne, his name lingered only in cautionary tales, whispered among crews in mess halls and hangars, the officer who thought pride could build machines only to be undone by a child's wisdom. His downfall became a lesson sharper than any reprimand. On a late autumn evening, Amelia, healthier now under proper care, locked the workshop for the night. Chloe lingered in the doorway, her eyes fixed on the horizon painted in amber and violet. Marcus approached quietly, the crunch of gravel underfoot announcing him. His uniform was gone, replaced by a simple jacket. For a long moment, he stood in silence. "You made me remember," he said at last, voice low, almost broken, "what it meant to serve, not just command." Then he turned away, fading into the dusk, leaving Chloe with only the echo of his words. Chloe smiled faintly, clutching her grandfather's old cap against her chest. In the stillness, she understood. Victories weren't always won on battlefields or in boardrooms. Sometimes they were found in the courage to listen, to heal, and to hope. The Titan hummed on, steady as a heartbeat, as if promising that from this night forward, no lesson of humility would ever be forgotten.